The cool night air prickled my skin as I stepped outside, my heart pounding harder with each step I took toward the barn. The property was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The path to the barn was illuminated only by faint moonlight, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Each step felt heavier than the last. My thoughts raced, a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and a creeping sense of dread. What could Robert be doing in the barn at midnight, especially with Sophie? Were they scheming behind my back? The barn loomed larger as I approached, its weathered wooden panels darkened by the night. I could just make out a soft, flickering glow spilling from one of the cracks in the door. Candlelight? I hesitated at the barn's entrance, pressing myself against the wall to avoid being seen. My fingers brushed against the rough wood as I steadied myself, straining to listen. Low voices murmured from within, just loud enough for me to catch snippets of their conversation. "Everything ready?" Sophie's voice floated through the crack in the door, calm and confident. "Yes," Robert replied, "but it has to be just right. We can't rush this." "Just right? What exactly couldn't they rush?" My stomach churned as I considered the implications. Was I walking into some elaborate betrayal? Or worse, was something more sinister unfolding? I fought the urge to burst in and confront them, reminding myself that I needed proof before making accusations. Through the crack in the door, I could see Robert standing near a small table set up in the barn. Sophie was beside him, her silhouette oddly still. Candles were scattered around the space, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. But what caught my attention most was what lay on the table. A small, locked box, and what appeared to be a folded piece of parchment. "What about her?" Sophie asked, her voice dropping into an almost whisper. Robert hesitated, his back to me. "She has no idea. It's all going according to plan." "Plan?" My blood ran cold. They're talking about me. My mind raced, piecing together their cryptic conversation. My pulse hammered in my ears as anger boiled to the surface. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. Without thinking, I shoved the barn door open, the creak of the hinges slicing through the quiet night like a knife. Robert and Sophie turned toward me, their expressions frozen in shock. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "Claire," Robert stammered, his hands flying up defensively. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I snapped, stepping closer. "Then explain it to me, Robert. Explain why you're sneaking out here in the middle of the night with her." I shot Sophie a glare, but she didn't flinch. She simply folded her arms, her calm demeanor only fueling my fury. "This isn't what it looks like," Robert insisted, his voice pleading. "I was planning something perfect, talking about me behind my back." "Don't lie to me, Robert. I heard you." Sophie finally spoke, her tone cool and measured. "Claire, maybe you should let him explain before jumping to conclusions." I turned my glare on her. "Stay out of this. I don't need advice from you." Robert stepped between us, his hands outstretched. "Please, just listen." But before he could finish, the sound of something heavy falling interrupted him. The thud echoed through the barn, and all three of us froze. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Robert and Sophie exchanged a glance, their earlier tension replaced by something else. Fear. "It's probably just the wind," Robert said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Sophie said, her eyes darting toward the back of the barn. "It came from the loft." We all turned toward the loft above us, where the shadows seemed to ripple and shift in the flickering candlelight. My anger was momentarily replaced by unease. The air in the barn felt heavier now, almost oppressive. "What's up there?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Nothing," Robert said too quickly. Sophie hesitated, her composure finally cracking. "We should leave." Robert nodded, but I wasn't ready to back down. "No, you two dragged me into this mess, and now I'm going to find out what's really going on." Before either of them could stop me, I grabbed a nearby ladder and climbed toward the loft. "Claire, wait," Robert called, but I ignored him. As I reached the top, the faint smell of decay hit me, sharp and sickening. My stomach churned as I pulled myself onto the platform, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just old tools and hay bales scattered around. But then my gaze landed on a dark shape in the corner. It was a man slumped against the wall, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes stared blankly ahead, and his skin had an unnatural grayish way. For a moment, I thought he was dead, but then he moved, his head lolling to the side as he let out a low, guttural moan. I screamed, scrambling backward. "Claire!" Robert's voice was closer now. He climbed up after me, his face pale as he took in the scene. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Who is he?" Robert didn't answer. He looked at Sophie, who had climbed up behind him, her expression grim. "You said he'd be gone by now," Robert hissed at her. "I thought he would be," Sophie shot back, her calm facade completely gone. "I didn't know he'd still be here." "Still be here?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What does that even mean?" Sophie sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's complicated." I glared at her. "Start explaining." "Now." Sophie hesitated, then finally spoke. "This property has history. My family's owned it for generations, but it's not just a ranch. It's a place where things happen. Strange things." "Like what?" I demanded. She gestured to the man in the corner. "Like him. People show up here sometimes. We don't know where they come from or why. They just appear, and then they disappear again." My blood turned to ice. "You're telling me this is normal?" "No," Sophie said firmly. "It's not normal, but it's the way things are." Robert stepped closer to me, his face drawn with worry. "Claire, I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to scare you. I thought it would be fine. I thought we could have a nice weekend and leave before anything happened." "Anything like this?" I gestured to the figure, who let out another low moan. Robert nodded, guilt etched on his face. "I'm sorry. I should have told you." I stared at him, my mind racing. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The man in the corner let out another sound, louder this time, and his head snapped up to look directly at me. His eyes were dark and empty, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Leave," he rasped, his voice echoing through the barn. "Before it's too late." That was all I needed to hear. Without another word, I turned and climbed down the ladder, my legs shaking. Robert and Sophie followed close behind, their earlier tension replaced by shared fear. As we stepped out of the barn, the night felt even darker, the silence heavier. I turned to Robert, my anger and confusion bubbling over. "We're leaving. Now." He didn't argue. We packed our things in record time, not saying a word to each other. Sophie watched us from the porch, her expression unreadable. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of the man in the barn or the way his empty eyes had seemed to follow me. Whatever secrets that property held, I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I would never set foot there again. The night air was cool and unusually still, the kind of silence that amplified every crunch of gravel underfoot. The desert seemed to hold its breath as I approached the barn. A faint glow seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls, and soft music carried in the air a romantic tune that struck a sour chord in my gut. Something about it felt wrong. I didn't bother being quiet. If Robert and Sophie were inside, they'd hear me coming. Let them. The barn door creaked open at the slightest touch. Inside, the sight froze me in place. String lights hung from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the room. The air was fragrant, with flowers carefully arranged in mason jars, and a table sat in the center, draped in white linen, with 2 place settings. It was beautiful, too beautiful. And there they were. Robert stood close to Sophie in the middle of the barn, their silhouettes outlined by the soft light. They didn't see me at first, but their proximity, his hand hovering near hers, her face tilted toward his, sent a surge of rage through me. "Sophie!" I yelled, my voice echoing in the quiet barn. She flinched, startled, and turned to face me. Her eyes widened, and she rushed outside as if to stop me from coming closer. "You were supposed to be asleep," she said quickly, her tone nervous. She planted herself in my path, her hands raised defensively. "Are you sleeping with my boyfriend?" The words tumbled out, raw and venomous. "What?" "No," she said, her face pale under the barn's glow. "Then what are you doing out here? Together?" She stammered, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Each second of hesitation stoked the fire in my chest. "Tell me the truth," I demanded, my voice rising as I stepped closer. "I can't," she whispered, her eyes darting to the ground. That was it. Something in me snapped. I shoved her hard, my fury spilling over. Sophie stumbled backward, her heels digging into the dirt as she fought to stay upright. "Don't touch me," she screamed, scrambling to her feet. Her anger mirrored mine as she lunged at me, and suddenly, we were locked in a wild, chaotic fight. It was unlike anything I'd experienced before, pure adrenaline and rage, punches and shoves landing wherever they could. I grabbed her foot, twisting hard. She screamed, her body jerking as she lost balance. Time slowed as she fell. I didn't notice the tree stump until it was too late. Her head struck it with a sickening crack. The world went still. I stood frozen, staring at her crumpled body. Blood seeped into the dirt from a gash on her head, glistening under the moonlight. Her eyes, half open, unfocused, were empty. "Sophie?" My voice was barely a whisper. She didn't move. Robert came running out of the barn, his face ashen. "What happened?" he shouted, his voice high with panic. "She attacked me," I blurted, my words tripping over each other. "It was an accident. She fell." He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he checked her pulse. "She's dead," he said softly, his voice hollow. "No." The word fell from my lips, weak and disbelieving. Robert stood slowly, his face twisted with anger and grief. "This doesn't look like an accident," he said, his voice sharp. "She attacked me," I repeated, desperation creeping into my tone. "I didn't mean to. She fell." Robert stared at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Why were you even out here with her?" I asked, my voice breaking. He hesitated, glancing at Sophie's lifeless form before sighing deeply. "Follow me," he said. "Why?" I demanded, my feet refusing to move. "Just come," he said flatly, turning back toward the barn. My legs felt like lead as I followed him inside. The barn was even more breathtaking up close. The warm glow of the lights, the carefully arranged decorations, the small, intimate table, it all felt surreal. Sophie was helping me set this up, Robert said, his voice void of emotion. It was supposed to be a surprise for tomorrow. A surprise? I echoed, dread pooling in my stomach. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small black box. The lid clicked open, revealing a diamond ring that sparkled in the light. I was going to propose, he said bitterly. The weight of his words hit me like a freight train. My breath caught as I stared at the ring, then at the lifeless body outside. You were going to propose? I asked weakly. That was the plan, he said, his tone icy. Until you killed her. I backed away from him, shaking my head. No, this can't be happening. But it was happening. The evidence was in the blood staining the dirt outside, in Robert's accusing glare, and in my trembling hands. We have to call someone, I said, my voice cracking. Robert scoffed, pacing the barn like a caged animal. And say what? That you attacked her because you thought we were having an affair? They'll never believe it was an accident. Tears blurred my vision. What are we supposed to do? He stopped and turned to me, his expression cold. We have to cover this up. What? I gasped, horrified. He stepped closer, his voice low and steady. If we don't, your life is over. Mine too. Do you understand that? I wanted to scream, to argue, to run, but I couldn't. He was right. If the truth came out, no one would believe me. My impulsive rage had already sealed my fate. We need to move her, he said, glancing outside. Bury her somewhere. No one will find her. No, I whispered, my chest tightening. I can't. You don't have a choice, he snapped. He grabbed a tarp from the corner of the barn and stormed outside. I followed, numb and unsteady, as he spread the tarp beside Sophie's body. The sight of her pale face made bile rise in my throat. Help me, he demanded, his tone harsh. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I bent down. Together, we lifted her onto the tarp, the weight of her body making the reality of what we were doing all too real. The desert swallowed us whole as we carried her into the night. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional hoot of an owl. Robert chose a spot near a cluster of cacti, far from the barn and any wandering eyes. As we dug, my mind raced. Could I live with this? Could I pretend Sophie had simply vanished, that her blood wasn't on my hands? When the grave was finally deep enough, we lowered her in and covered her with the dry, unforgiving earth. The barn was eerily quiet when we returned, the romantic ambience now a twisted mockery of what had transpired. We can't tell anyone about this, Robert said firmly, breaking the silence. Ever. I nodded, too drained to argue. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of what I'd done pressed heavier on my chest. I started hearing things, Sophie's voice calling my name in the wind, the faint sound of her laughter in the dead of night. The barn became a place of nightmares. I avoided it at all costs, but the guilt followed me everywhere. Robert, too, seemed changed. He spoke less, his eyes always distant, as if he were haunted by the same ghosts. One night, I woke to the sound of soft music drifting through my window, a romantic tune that sent chills down my spine. I crept to the window and peered outside. The barn was glowing again, its lights flickering faintly in the darkness. And in the doorway, I saw her, Sophie. Her figure was bathed in the golden light, her head tilted just as it had been that night. Her lifeless eyes met mine, and she raised a hand, pointing directly at me. I screamed, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked again, the barn was dark. She was gone. Or maybe she was never gone at all.